Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hi, Asset Reliability at Work podcast listeners. I'm Tara Holwegner, your host for today's podcast, and I'm here with John Cray, a principal consultant with Lifecycle Engineering. Hey, John, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So today we're going to talk about John's recently published Industry Week article. In it, he discusses how leadership vision and behavior can develop a culture that values data integrity and effectively utilizes their CMMS system. I know a lot of our listeners today are going to be interested in hearing how to establish a set of CMMS guiding principles and business rules so that they can have consistency and data integrity in their system use. Lastly, we're going to talk about how measures and audits can motivate and sustain desired CMMS use. So with that, I'm going to ask our first question today of John. John, why do manufacturing organizations need to factor in culture change when they set up and implement a CMMS?
Well, I think it's important to describe what is culture, because culture has many definitions. One that I use is culture is defined by the written and unwritten rules that an organization follows. Many of these are based upon experiences and consequences, and in many organizations, the unwritten rules carry more weight with lasting impacts. So why consider culture when implementing a CMMS? If an organization is implementing some new software or re-implementing existing software, somewhere there's a business case for doing so. The solution to achieving the business case should involve three key aspects. One is technology or the software itself. Two is having a set of standard business processes defined on paper. And third is the people systems. And this is where culture should be part of your three-part solution. With respect to culture, to start with, you want to assess the current organization's understanding and the organization's value for using a CMMS, as well as the importance of having good quality data going into the CMMS and coming back out.
I see. So 3 parts to your implementation: the technology itself, your business processes, and then the people side. Do they value the CMMS, and what do they think about data integrity or quality data, and how does that define your culture? So let's talk a little bit more about the organization. What levels or positions within a plant or a facility should be responsible for creating this culture that embraces the CMMS and cares about data integrity?
Well, I would simply start with the leader of the plant, if it's a manufacturing environment, or the facility, if it's a facilities maintenance environment, and the leadership team, because at the end of the day, if it's important to the leadership, it's important. I would expect in a production environment to have the production function, the maintenance function, the engineering, procurement, and HR functional leaders on the leadership team. Additionally, if you're working in a union environment, you want to engage the elected union leadership since they are stakeholders as well. Second, I would engage the CMMS project team. Assuming they are from outside the site, you want to create alignment and understanding within the two groups. Here at LCE, we utilize partnership agreements to help align and develop win-win working relationships between organizations such as the leadership team and the project team. Third, I strongly recommend the site leadership team, with input from their functional organizations, develop a set of guiding principles for CMMS use and for data integrity.
So get a cross-functional team that includes leadership from your site as well as outside stakeholders. You talked a little bit about, or you mentioned, governing principles, guiding principles, and partnership agreements. John, you've been heavily involved with helping organizations get to a point where they've established these guidelines. So what are those guidelines or principles?
So in the article, I identified or suggested 10 guiding principles. And certainly, let me start by saying this is not the absolute correct list to use for all sites. The list in the article is really meant to spur dialogue within the leadership team. There are typically 4 on that list that I use all the time, not to provide a client with the answer, but to get them to discuss and dialogue around what they believe should be their set of guiding principles. The first one that I use is no work order, no work. And that usually gets a lot of people talking about how can I get work done without a work order. And in essence, what we're trying to do there is get the leadership team to process that all work done should be documented on a work order and captured in your CMMS. That also begs the question then, well, what about emergency work? And the point there would be to respond to the emergency, take care of the immediate concern that the production unit or facilities has, and then after the fact, document that event on a work order. Second guiding principle that tends to get a lot of discussion is having all your spare parts with a item number in your CMMS. And that includes whether it's a stocked item or a non-stocked item. And the point here is that you want to identify all your materials and have those that are going to be set up in your stores room with good information associated with it for reordering. Likewise, you want to be able to identify those non-stock materials and have good ordering information for them as well. Third guiding principle that I use has to do with the 400% rule. And a lot of people always ask, what do you mean by the 400% rule? I'm not the owner of this, but I use it all the time to spur discussion. But it simply goes that 100% of your internal labor, 100% of your materials, 100% of your contractor cost are documented on a work order 100% of the time. And again, the purpose in the 400% rule is to create a guiding principle to aspire to. You're not going to start off having 400% accomplished on the very first day of your implementation, but you're going to aspire to achieve the 400% rule. And then lastly, I want to get the leadership teams also talking about their equipment. And here I use a guiding principle that all equipment failures receive a root cause analysis. The point here is to get people to discuss, well, what do you mean by an equipment failure and what do you mean by root cause analysis? So I always view equipment failures like safety incidents. You don't want them to occur. So when one does occur, you should be asking the question, what failed and why should it fail? And your first line of defense is your tradespeople. In 2 minutes or less, they can document what failed on the piece of equipment and capture why it failed and get that captured back onto your work order. If it's a more repeatable event that's failing, that's where you may engage an engineer and spend a little more time on a root cause analysis. Or if you have a significant event that happens once in a blue moon, that's where you may form a team of people. So part of the guiding principle is to get people thinking about levels of root cause analysis and how to document those for historical purposes. But it's very important that a leadership team come up with their own unique set of guiding principles, so at the end of the day, they own what they create.
Podcast listeners, I think those comments right there were worth your spending your time on listening to us today. John shared 4 great guiding principles from his article. Ultimately, the plant's got to decide on their own, but I love these. No work order, no work. Spare should have an item number in the CMMS, the 400% rule, and all failures should have some sort of an RCA. So you've selected your guidelines. The guidelines are set. What comes next?
So first, you want to develop a set of business processes and business rules for how to follow these business processes. This includes the appropriate but critical few measures that will be generated as part of your CMS rollout for managing your business processes. These processes also then drive the development of your training materials. Once you've completed those, you want to move to project preparation. And most importantly, in preparing the organization for change, you want to have a good communication plan. And the first part of that communication plan is to prepare your management staffs for implementation of your new CMMS. It's very important to prepare them to be able to answer questions around why are we implementing new software, what's the business benefit, what's changing, what's not changing, and ultimately prepare your management staff to answer the question that everybody in the organization is going to ask, which is, what's in it for me, or how is this change going to affect me? After you've communicated to the organization what's coming, time to start conducting the training, and when training's complete, then you move to go live implementation. And this is where your new business processes are implemented. People are now following the new business rules and using the software in support of these new business processes. This is also where you begin to record data and report progress out of your CMMS. And ultimately, with the set of guiding principles defined, leadership is now recognizing and rewarding new behaviors to move the culture to a new level. And lastly, this is where leadership can recognize and reward the new behaviors in support of implementing a new CMS and following the guiding principles.
So, John, what I'm hearing is that it's not just about implementing the software. There's a lot to be done before, during, and after software implementation to make sure that your CMMS is being used and that you're getting the business results that you want from your software. So now let's move on from implementation and project planning. Let's talk about after implementation. You mentioned in your article about measuring and reporting results and rewarding the right behaviors. And you just talked a little bit about it right now. So let's talk more about the measurements. Are they all the same, or do they differ for each organization? And what might be some good measurements that a planner or a site might want to consider?
So first of all, yes, you want to reward the right behaviors and recognize progress towards your goals. The metrics and the movement towards accomplishing your goals, leadership provides a reinforcement with accomplishing these results. It's a great opportunity for leadership to provide communication and feedback to the organization. Are the measurements the same, or are they different for each organization, you ask? At Lifecycle Engineering, we recommend a standard set of measures for each of the work streams like work management, materials management, and reliability engineering. But additionally, every organization has a unique set of challenges and problems and a unique current state where they're migrating from. So you also want to have some unique transition metrics that each organization should use that's specific to them. So when you ask what might some of those metrics be, so first the process measures. In the work management area, backlog, schedule compliance are a couple of metrics you'd use in work management. In materials management, you would look at things like the number of jobs with a kit to support the planning and scheduling function. Stockouts is another metric, but also transition metrics. So if you're not well versed at capturing data in a CMMS, you want to start to assess how many labor hours and how much cost am I capturing in my CMMS compared to my accounting system. Or you may want to document the number of work orders generated by supervisor. So some form of transition metric that's unique to your set of circumstances that you want to improve upon. And then lastly, everybody has a very common set of lagging indicators. So in a manufacturing environment, this would be volume of units produced, budget compliance. Some of your safety stats would be considered lagging indicators. So those would be pretty common across most manufacturing organizations.
Thanks for giving us some clarity, John, around different leading and lagging metrics that you may want to combine and use to measure your program progress. Well, I definitely think that you've given a lot of our podcast listeners something to think about and some great information that they can take with them when they're making decisions on CMMS. For all of our podcast listeners, we are going to have a link to John's Industry Week article in the show notes. So, John, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast, and we hope to get you again in the studio soon.
Looking forward to being here.
All right. So podcast listeners, thanks again for joining us, and check the show notes for the Industry Week article. Also, John mentioned some of our work streams and that there are different measures and different processes that Lifecycle Engineering uses. If you want to learn more, you can always take a look at our website or email us directly at info@lce.com. Until next time, thanks us at Reliability at Work listeners.
Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's two ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.